In the autumn of 1853, on a withering sugar plantation situated roughly 40 miles south of Baton Rouge, an enslaved house servant by the name of Celestine was summoned to her mistress's bedchamber and instructed to secure the door from within. She would not emerge for another 11 days. When the overseer finally forced the lock on the morning of November 14th, what he discovered inside that shuttered space was so profoundly unspeakable that the family paid the parish sheriff $600 in silver to incinerate every document pertaining to the estate of Madame Honorine Thibodeaux. However, 3 pages managed to survive. They had been inside the lining of a slave's apron and smuggled past the back gate of Belle Fontaine before daybreak. I have devoted the last 4 years to tracing where those pages eventually traveled, and what they contain mentally rewrites everything we understood about how wealth was transferred during the final years of the old French plantation system in Louisiana. Before we proceed further into the story of Belle Fontaine and the events that transpired inside Madame Thibodeaux's bedchamber, take a moment to subscribe to this channel. Activate the notification bell so you won't miss our next investigation. And let me know in the comments which state or city you are tuning in from at this very moment. I am curious to know how far this story is reaching tonight. Now, allow me to transport you back to a river parish where the Spanish moss hung so thickly from the live oaks that it seemed to muffle all sound, where the sugar boilers operated without pause from October through January, and where a single family, the Thibodeaux, had laid claim to the same 720 arpents of bottomland ever since 1741. Belle Fontaine was not the largest plantation in the parish, but it was undoubtedly the oldest. The main house had been constructed in the French colonial fashion, elevated on brick piers as protection against the Mississippi's flooding. Its wrap-around gallery was shaded by 6 immense oaks planted by the founder, Armand Thibodeaux, more than a century before the events of our story unfold. The walls were made of cypress. The floors were heart pine so aged they appeared nearly black. And by the time Madame Honorine Thibodeaux took to her bed in the spring of 1853, the house had already outlived 3 generations of the family that had built it. She stood as the last surviving member. Her husband, Leopold, had succumbed to yellow fever 15 years prior. Her 3 sons had each died young, 2 in infancy, and the third, her cherished Pascal, at the age of 19 in a duel sparked by a gambling debt in New Orleans. She had 1 remaining child, a daughter named Odette, who had married a merchant from St. Louis and had not stepped foot on Belle Fontaine in over a decade. Honorine was 73 years old in the autumn of 53. She weighed less than 90 pounds. Her left side had gone slack after what the parish doctor termed a minor stroke the previous winter, and she could no longer walk without assistance. Yet her mind, the house servants claimed, was sharper than ever before, and her cruelty, which had always been formidable, had narrowed to a single, obsessive point. She was determined not to let Odette inherit Belle Fontaine. The household at Belle Fontaine in the autumn of 1853 consisted of the following: Madame Honorine herself, confined to the large corner bedchamber on the 2nd floor that overlooked the rear gardens. Her nephew, Arsène Pontalba, 34 years old and unmarried, who had arrived from New Orleans 3 years earlier under the pretense of helping manage the estate, and who had not left. An overseer named Bertrand Sicard, a Cajun from the Atchafalaya Basin, rough in manner but meticulous in his work. A Creole housekeeper named Madame Voisin, born free in Saint-Domingue, who had come to the plantation as a girl following the uprising and had served the Thibodeaux family for 51 years, and 47 enslaved men, women, and children, of whom 9 worked within the house, and the remainder in the cane fields and sugar mill. Of those 9 house servants, one name stands above all others: Celestine. She was 26 years old. She had been born on Belle Fontaine. Her mother, Philomene, a seamstress, had served as Honorine's personal maid for 30 years before succumbing to consumption in the winter of 51. After her mother's death, Celestine was promoted from the laundry and assigned to attend Madame Thibaudeau's directly. By every account I have been able to uncover, she was a quiet woman, tall for her era, nearly 5'9", literate in French, which her mother had secretly taught her against the law, steady of hand, and possessed, according to the testimony Madame Voisin gave years later to a freedmen's bureau officer in 1867, an unusual capacity to endure without complaint. Madame Voisin called it, in Creole French, une patience terrible, a terrible patience. But the housekeeper intended it as praise. She would later come to mean it as something else entirely, to grasp what Belle Fontaine smelled and sounded like in the autumn of 53. You must understand the sugar parish in that season. The harvest in Louisiana begins in October and continues until Christmas. Every plantation for 40 miles along the river was burning cane trash and boiling syrup simultaneously. And from the middle of October onward, the air was thick with a sweetness so heavy it coated the back of the throat and refused to dissipate. At night, from the upper gallery of any big house, you could see the orange glow of a dozen sugar houses along the river, each one a smudge of light beneath a column of smoke that did not rise because the air was too still. The fields themselves were cut in sections, with standing cane towering over the men who entered them with long curved knives at 400 in the morning, and did not emerge again until sunset. The slaves worked in gangs under the direction of drivers, the cane stalks falling in rows, the wagons hauling them to the mill, the rollers crushing them for juice, and the juice moving through a series of open copper kettles, where it was reduced, purified, and finally granulated. The work never ceased. The fire beneath the kettles did not go out from October to December. The men who tended the boilers slept in shifts of 4 hours, and half of them were dead from accidents, exhaustion, or pneumonia by the time they reached 40 years of age. This was the system that Belle Fontaine had operated, unchanged in its essentials since 1741, and the only thing that shifted from generation to generation was the names of those who tended it, along with the slow refinement of cruelty required to keep it functioning. By 1853, the plantation was producing roughly 400 hogsheads of sugar annually at prices fluctuating between 5 and 9 cents per pound on the New Orleans market. In a prosperous year, it yielded an income of perhaps 30 $30,000. In a poor year, it produced nothing and had to be sustained by credit from the factors on Gravier Street. The existing will of Madame Honorine, the one drafted in 1841 following the death of her husband, valued the estate as a whole, including the land, buildings, machinery, and the 47 enslaved individuals at somewhere between $120,000 and $150,000 in 1853. That was equivalent to several $1 million in modern currency. It was, in short, a fortune. And it was this fortune, and the century of accumulated blood that had produced it, that Madame Honorine was preparing to weaponize against her daughter in the final weeks of her life. Madame Voisin deserves a second mention. She was 63 years old in the autumn of 53. She had been born in Mai, on the southern coast of what was then the French colony of Saint-Domingue, to a free woman of color who operated a small dressmaking business. She was 12 years old in the summer of 1803 when her mother placed her aboard a schooner bound for New Orleans, with 240 other refugees fleeing the final collapse of the French colonial regime. She had arrived in Louisiana with nothing. She had been taken into the Thibaudeau's household at 14 as a kitchen helper under an arrangement whose details have been lost to history. and she had ascended over 5 decades to become, in all but name, the manager of the household. She had watched Leopold Thibodeaux die. She had delivered 2 of Madame Honorine's children. She had laid out the bodies of both infants on the dining room table for the family to mourn. She had watched Pascal Thibodeaux grow from a thoughtful boy into a reckless young man, and had not been surprised, although she was deeply grieved when the news arrived from New Orleans that he had been killed in the duel. She had known Odette since birth. She had known Celestine since birth. She understood everything that was unfolding in the autumn of '53, because she had spent 50 years watching the family that owned her for wages prepare this moment, without knowing they were preparing it. And she had made a decision, though she had not yet told anyone, that she would not allow the elderly woman upstairs to finish her work. Bertrand Sicard, the overseer, was 39 years old. He was the son of Acadian fishermen from the Atchafalaya Basin, poorly educated, capable, violent when necessary, not sadistic by the standards of his profession, and loyal to whoever paid his wages. He had worked at Belle Fontaine for 9 years. He knew the cane fields better than any man on the plantation. He did not like Arce ni Pontalba. He respected Madame Honorine in the way one respects a dangerous animal. And over the previous summer, he had begun to privately wonder whether he should seek employment elsewhere, because he could sense, without being able to articulate it, that something at Belle Fontaine was drawing to a close. The sugar harvest of '53 was expected to be the most profitable in 20 years. Prices in New Orleans were robust. The rains had come at the right moments. The cane stood 11 feet high by mid-October, and the mill was set to begin rolling on the 24th. But on the afternoon of October 12th, an event occurred at Belle Fontaine that would eventually summon the parish sheriff, a notary from Baton Rouge, a Catholic priest from Donaldsonville, and finally a team of men with shovels to a spot in the back garden where nothing was supposed to be buried. That afternoon, Madame Honorine summoned her nephew Arseny to her bedchamber. She had been refusing to see him for 8 days. When he arrived, she was sitting upright against her pillows, which was itself unusual, and she held in her lap a sealed leather portfolio that Madame Voisin would later identify as the one in which Leopold Thibodeaux had kept his most important private papers, and which had not been opened since his death. Arseny emerged from the bedchamber 40 minutes later. He was, according to the kitchen girl who saw him on the back stairs, white as linen. He went directly to the stables, ordered his horse saddled, then rode to Donaldsonville and did not return for 3 days. On the afternoon of October 15th, Arseny returned with a notary. The notary was a man named Auguste Delacroix, 61 years old, known throughout the parish as a meticulous drafter of wills and acts of donation. He carried a leather satchel and a case of writing instruments. He was shown directly to Madame Honorine's bedchamber, where he remained for 2 hours. When he emerged, Madame Voisin asked him in the corridor whether Madame intended to revise her testament. The notary looked at the housekeeper for a long moment. Then he said, in careful French, that what Madame Thibodeaux was planning was not a mere revision. He descended the stairs without further explanation and rode back to Donaldsonville. That evening, Celestine was called upstairs. She had served Madame's dinner in the bedchamber every evening for 2 years. This was not unusual. What was unusual was the instruction she received upon entering. Madame Honorine, propped against her pillows by the bolsters arranged that morning, told Celestine to set down the tray and close the door. Celestine closed the door. Then Madame Honorine told her to turn the key in the lock. Celestine turned the key. Then Madame Honorine, in a voice so low that Celestine had to step closer to the bed to hear it, instructed the young woman that she was to remain in that room, not leaving for any reason except to empty the chamber pot in the adjoining closet, and that Madame Voisin would bring food to the door at intervals, but would not be permitted to enter. Celestine was to sleep on the small daybed at the foot of Madame's own bed. She was not to speak to anyone through the door. She was not to pass any object out of the room, and if anyone, including Monsieur Arseny, attempted to enter, Celestine was to refuse. Celestine, who was 26 years old and had been owned by this family her entire life, who had watched her mother die in a drafty room behind the kitchen because Madame Honorine would not permit a doctor to be called for a slave, said nothing. She set down the tray. She turned back to the door. She locked it, and for 11 days she did not come out. It would be tempting at this point in the story to leap ahead to the morning of November 14th, and to what the overseer discovered when he broke the lock. I will not do that yet, because what matters most about Belle Fontaine in the autumn of '53 is not what was found inside that room at the end. It is what was being done inside that room during those 11 days. And to understand that, we must understand what Madame Honorine Thibaudaux was willing to destroy in order to protect her hatred of her only surviving daughter. Odette Thibaudaux had married at the age of 19 a St. Louis merchant named Hyacinthe Cailloux. Hyacinthe was American by then, though his family was of French descent from the upper Mississippi. He was a commission merchant in the river trade. Respectable, prosperous, a Catholic. By every reasonable measure, he was an acceptable match for the daughter of a Louisiana planter. But Madame Honorine had never forgiven him for one thing. At the wedding dinner at Belle Fontaine, Hyacinthe Cailloux had made a remark in the presence of 14 guests, including the priest and the parish judge, to the effect that the days of the plantation system were numbered, and that a man of vision would prepare to diversify his wealth into northern manufactures and St. Louis real estate. He had meant it kindly, as advice to his new mother-in-law, whose husband had recently died, and whose estate he worried might not survive the coming decades unchanged. Honorine had heard it as an attack on everything her family had built for 100 years. She had heard it as a prediction of her defeat. And she had begun, from that night forward, to plan how Odette and Hyacinthe Cailloux would never inherit one arpent of Belle Fontaine. By the laws of Louisiana, this was not easy. Louisiana, alone among the states, retained the Napoleonic Code, and with it the doctrine of forced heirship. A parent could not simply disinherit a child. A portion of the estate, called the legitime, was reserved to the children by operation of law, and no will or act of donation could defeat it. If Odette was Madame Honorine's only surviving child, Odette was entitled, by the black letter of the law, to 3/4 of the succession. Honorine could give the remaining quarter, called the disposable portion, to whomever she pleased. But Odette's 3/4 she could not touch, not by will, not by sale on favorable terms to a nephew, not by any ordinary act, unless Madame Honorine could prove, by documentary evidence filed before a notary, that Odette had committed against her mother one of the specific acts recognized by Article 1521 of the Civil Code as grounds for disinheritance. There were 10 such grounds in Louisiana in 1853. They included striking a parent, attempting to take a parent's life, refusing to ransom a parent held captive. Most of them required physical acts committed under specific witnessed circumstances. They were, in practice, almost impossible to prove, except the ninth. The ninth ground for disinheritance under the Civil Code of 1825, as it stood in Louisiana in the autumn of '53, was this: a child who had refused food to a parent in necessity could be disinherited by the parent if the fact was established in authentic form before a notary and 2 witnesses. and if the act of disinheritance specified the cause, and if the cause was sworn to by the parent, in writing under oath while of sound mind. Madame Honorine Thibodeaux intended to swear in writing under oath before the notary Augustus Delacroix that her daughter Odette had refused to send her during the previous of her hymnus the remittances Odette had promised. She intended to swear that she had written 3 letters to Odette requesting assistance, and that none had been answered. She intended to produce those letters, or copies of them, in her own hand, and to produce also the drafts she claimed she had mailed, and which she claimed her daughter had never acknowledged. She intended, in short, to fabricate, within the intimacy of her locked bedchamber, the documentary record of a crime that had never occurred. And she intended that Celestine, the only person in the house who was to remain in the room with her, should be the physical instrument of that fabrication, because Madame Honorine's left hand was now useless and her right hand had begun to tremble so badly in the previous month that she could no longer form her own letters with any consistency. She needed someone who could write, someone who could imitate her handwriting under her close supervision, someone who could not testify, someone whose presence in the room could be concealed, whose absence from her normal duties could be explained by illness, and whose silence could be guaranteed by ownership. She needed Celestine. Before we go any further into what happened in that locked room, I want to ask you a question. Stop for a moment and consider it. In a society that held human beings as property, that forbade the enslaved to read or write, that stripped them of every legal recognition as persons, what does it mean that the entire machinery of that society's inheritance, its wealth, its upper deity, its generational continuity, its carefully constructed legal fictions, could come to depend on the hand of a 26-year-old woman who had been taught to read in secret by her dying mother? If you are finding this story as disturbing as I found the documents that reveal it, please hit the like button right now. It genuinely helps the channel reach more people who care about the forgotten corners of American history. Let me know in the comments what you think Celestine did. Madame Voisin was the first to understand that something was wrong. On the morning of the 13th of October, she brought a breakfast tray to the bedchamber door, as instructed. The door opened only far enough for Celestine's hand to emerge and take the tray. The housekeeper caught a glimpse of the room beyond. She saw Madame Honorine sitting at a small writing desk that had been moved from the window to the side of the bed. She saw papers. She saw an inkwell. She saw Celestine standing behind Madame's chair with her hand. Madame Voisin later insisted, guiding Madame's hand across a sheet of paper. The carriage stopped here. Then the door closed. I believe you are mistaken. That evening, Madame Voisin went to Arseny. She told him what she had seen. Arseny was drunk, which was his condition most evenings by that point in the year. But he listened. He said that his aunt was entitled to the privacy of her own bedchamber. He said the housekeeper should mind her own affairs. He said that if Madame Voisin valued her position, she would not mention this to anyone else in the house. Then he poured himself another glass of brandy. But Arseny was not as indifferent as he pretended. That same night, after Madame Voisin had gone to her own quarters, he walked up the stairs and stood outside his aunt's bedchamber for a long time. He heard from within the sound of his aunt's voice speaking in the low, continuous murmur of dictation. He heard the sound of a pen scratching against paper. He did not hear Celestine's voice at all. He went back down the stairs. He wrote a letter to the notary Delacroix in Donaldsonville. He gave the letter to the stable boy with instructions to ride before dawn, and then he began to wait. What Arsène wanted in the autumn of '53 was a little more complicated than it appeared. He was Madame Honorine's nearest male relative after her daughter. He was a Pontalba on his mother's side, a Thibodeaux by blood through his grandfather. He had come to Belle Fontaine in the spring of '50 because he had gambled away his own inheritance in the New Orleans faro houses and had nowhere else to go. His aunt had taken him in reluctantly. She had given him the north guest room and an allowance of $4 a month. She had made it clear, repeatedly in his presence and in the presence of others, that he would inherit nothing. The estate was to go 3/4 to Odette by forced heirship and 1/4 by will to the Catholic Diocese of New Orleans for the maintenance of a charity hospital. The diocese, not Arsène, not one picayune to Arsène, but in the last 2 years something had changed. Madame Honorine's health had collapsed. Her hatred of her daughter had grown into something monstrous. And Arsène had begun to understand that if he was patient, if he was useful, if he was present when the notary came, he might find himself named in the New Testament for a larger share than the disposable quarter would ordinarily suggest. He had in fact believed, until October 12th, that this was what was happening. He had believed that his aunt was making him her residuary legatee, that she would use her disposable portion to give him everything she legally could, and that he would manage the remaining 3/4 on Odette's behalf as executor for years, perhaps decades. But what he had heard in his aunt's bedchamber on October 12th, when he had been summoned and shown the sealed leather portfolio, was something else entirely. His aunt had told him that she intended to disinherit Odette altogether, completely, by sworn affidavit under Article 1521, or, as she had told him, she would then leave the entire estate, every arpent, every slave, every stick of furniture, by New Testament to 2 parties jointly, himself, Arsène Pontalba, to receive 1/2, and the Diocese of New Orleans to receive the other half in trust for a foundation in the name of her dead son Pascal. Half of Belle Fontaine, half of 720 arpents of sugar land, half of 47 slaves, half of the house itself, the oldest French colonial house in the parish, with its cypress walls, its heart pine floors, and its 6 enormous oaks. It was more than Arsène had ever dreamed, and he had walked out of that bedchamber on October 12th white as linen. Not because he was horrified. He had walked out white as linen because he understood at last that he had become necessary to his aunt's revenge, and because he understood that revenge would make him rich, and because some part of him, the part that still remembered being a boy and being held by his aunt on the gallery at Belle Fontaine on a summer evening 30 years before, recoiled at what he was about to help his aunt do, his only cousin. He recoiled. And then he wrote to Donaldsonville and brought back the notary. The notary, Auguste Delacroix, deserves a paragraph of his own. He was not a bad man. He was, by the standards of his time and profession, a conscientious one. He had drafted testaments for 40 years in the river parishes and had seen every variety of family cruelty that wealth can breed. He knew when he arrived at Belle Fontaine on October 15th what Madame Honorine was proposing. He had received her preliminary letter the week before. He had read Article 1521 3 times on the ride to the plantation, and he had made, before he dismounted in the oak alley, a private decision. He would take Madame's declarations. He would record them. He would take the evidence she presented. But he would not certify the act of disinheritance until he had personally written to Odette Cailloux in Satine, Louis, and given her the opportunity to respond. This was not required by law. Under the code, the parent's sworn statement before the notary and 2 witnesses was sufficient. But Delacroix had his own conscience, and he had filed away. In the sitting room of his office in Donaldsonville, 3 letters from Odette Cayliox written over the previous 18 months to the parish priest of Donaldsonville, now inquiring after her mother's health and enclosing remittances in cash to be used for her mother's care at the priest's discretion, since the mother had refused to correspond directly. Delacroix knew, in other words, that Madame Honorine's claim was false. He did not yet know how he would act on that knowledge. But he had decided, riding through the oak alley on the 15th of October, that he would not act against it either. He spent 2 hours in the bedchamber. He took down, in his notary's precise script, the sworn declarations Madame Honorine dictated to him. He noted, in his private journal, that Madame's declarations were supported by what she called copies of her letters, and of letters allegedly sent by her daughter, and that these documents, he observed with interest, all appeared to be written in the same hand, namely, Madame Honorine's own. He noted that the copies of Odette's alleged letters contained, in their phrasing, several Louisiana French idioms that Odette, having lived in St. Louis for a decade, and having written her mother in English for years, would have been unlikely to use. He noted that Madame Honorine was dictating her declarations in a voice that was, though weak, entirely lucid, and that she appeared to be of sound mind within the legal meaning of that term. He noted all of this, and then he took the documents Madame Honorine handed him, sealed them in a leather satchel, placed them in the locked chest, bolted to the floor of his office the next day, and wrote, that same evening, a letter to Odette Cayliox in St. Louis, telling her nothing specific but requesting that she come immediately to Louisiana on a matter concerning her mother's estate. That letter would not reach St. Louis until November 2nd. Odette would not leave St. Louis until November 5th. She would not arrive at Belle Fontaine until November 18th. By then, everything would be over. Inside the locked bedchamber, meanwhile, through the last days of October and the first 2 weeks of November, Celestine was doing what she had been told to do. And it was something almost no one in the house understood, because almost no one in the house could have done it. She was forging her mistress's correspondence under Madame Honorine's direction, sitting at the small writing desk beside the bed. Celestine was producing, one after another, the letters that would constitute the evidence of Odette's alleged refusal of support. There were 3 categories. First, copies of letters Madame Honorine claimed to have written to Odette during the previous winter, begging for remittances. These Celestine produced in an imitation of her mistress's own hand, which she had studied by watching Madame Honorine write for 2 years. Second, letters from Odette to Madame, replying with refusals or with silence. These were harder. Celestine had never seen Odette's hand. Madame had preserved, in the sealed leather portfolio her husband had left, 2 genuine letters Odette had written to her father many years before. Celestine had these in front of her. She studied them. She practiced on scraps of paper. And then she produced, in Odette's hand, as best she could imitate it, replies that were curt, dismissive, and cruel. Third, and this was the most audacious of the 3, an affidavit in Odette's own hand and over Odette's forged signature, allegedly written to a St. Louis notary, acknowledging that she had received her mother's requests and had decided not to respond. This document was intended to be discovered, much later, among Odette's papers, and to be produced against her in any legal challenge she might raise. It was the masterpiece of the forgery. It was also the document that, more than any other, reveals what kind of woman Madame Honorine Thibodeaux had become at the end of her life. Celestine wrote these documents by candlelight, by oil lamp, by the gray morning light through the shuttered windows. She wrote slowly. She checked each letter against the genuine samples. She rewrote pages when her hand slipped or her imitation wavered. Madame Honorine watched her, correcting, insisting, demanding that the language be period appropriate, that the paper be aged with diluted coffee, that the ink be mixed with just enough iron gall to look old. When Celestine finished a document, Madame Honorine would take it in her trembling right hand, hold it close to her face, and read it. Sometimes she would nod, and Celestine would set it aside in the completed pile. Sometimes she would shake her head and hand it back, and Celestine would burn it in the small porcelain dish by the bed and begin again. The physical process of producing a convincing forgery in 1853 was more complicated than we might think. Paper, first of all, could not be obtained fresh and made to look old. The grain of the paper itself, the weight, the rag content, the watermark, had to match what would have been available in the year the letter was supposedly written. Madame Honorine had, for this purpose, a stack of blank sheets that she had been collecting for years out of the backs of older correspondence. Cutting the blank portions away, storing them in a locked drawer, she had sheets from 1852, 1851, 1850, each one separated by ribbon and labeled. The ink had to match the period. Iron gall ink in the 1850s oxidized to a particular shade of brown over the course of months and years, and a freshly mixed batch could not reproduce that color without aging. Madame had prepared, also in advance, a small bottle of heavily oxidized ink, held back from her husband's correspondence after his death in '38, which she had diluted and was now reserving for the most critical documents. The diluted coffee was used, not on the whole page, but in small spots at the corners, simulating the natural foxing that old paper develops. The folds had to match the pattern a letter would have acquired from being folded into an envelope, carried in a saddlebag, unfolded, refolded, stored in a drawer. Celestine learned to simulate all of this. She learned it in 3 days. The handwriting itself was the hardest part. A person's hand is as distinctive as a voice, and it changes in subtle ways over the course of a lifetime. Madame Honorine's hand in 1853 was not the hand she had written with in 1843, and a forgery dated 10 years earlier had to reflect that older hand, which meant Celestine had to work not only from Madame's current handwriting, but from older samples Madame produced from the leather portfolio. Letters Madame had written to her husband in the 30s, to her mother in the 20s. Celestine had to learn 3 different versions of her mistress's hand, and to produce each one consistently. Odette's hand, which Celestine had only the 2 old letters to work from, was even more difficult. Odette, as a young woman, wrote with a rounder, more careful hand than she presumably used now. Celestine had to extrapolate. She had to imagine what that hand would have become 20 years on, under the pressure of a merchant's household in St. Louis, and produce it. Madame Honorine, watching her, understood after the first day that she had chosen correctly. Celestine's hand was better than hers had ever been. Celestine's eye was more precise. Celestine's patience with the slow, exhausting work of letter by letter imitation was greater than Madame's own would have been at any point in her life. There were moments, in the gray light of the early afternoon, when Madame Honorine watched the young woman bent over the writing desk, her dark hair catching the light from the oil lamp, her fingers moving the pen in small, deliberate arcs, and felt something she had not felt since her son, Pascal, had died. It was a kind of astonishment. Astonishment that this person, who by the laws she lived under was property, was producing with her own hand a technical accomplishment that Madame herself could not have produced, that a notary would be unable to detect, that would stand up in a court of law and strip a Thibodeau's daughter of her birthright. And it was astonishment, and it was gratitude. And it was a particular kind of hatred that comes from understanding that the hand one depends on is the hand one has tried to keep from existing. For the first 3 days, Celestine worked in silence. Madame Honorine spoke only to instruct. Celestine answered only in monosyllables. They ate separately. Madame from the tray Madame Voisin brought, and which Celestine had to carry from the door to the bedside. Celestine from whatever was left after her mistress had finished. They did not speak to each other about what they were doing or why. But on the 4th day, something began to shift. And this is the part of the story that I had not expected when I first began to reconstruct it. And that changes its meaning entirely. Madame Honorine began to talk, not to instruct, not to dictate, to talk about her life, about her sons, about Pascal, who had died in the duel at 19, about the way Pascal had laughed, about the particular green color of his eyes, about her husband Leopold, whom she had loved, and not loved, whom she had helped through 3 bad harvests in the 40s, whose gambling had nearly ruined them all, about her mother and her mother's mother and the founding of Belle Fontaine by her grandfather Armand, who had come up the Mississippi from New Orleans as a boy and had cleared the first 100 arpents with his own hands, of the hands of the 11 Senegambian men he had bought at the Charters Street Market of the spring of 1740. About Odette, about the way Odette as a child had been afraid of the storms that rolled in off the Gulf, and how Honorine had sat with her daughter through those storms, and how she, Honorine, had believed in those moments that she loved her daughter more than she had ever loved anyone, about how that love had curdled into something she could not name, about how she hated her daughter now, how her hatred was the only thing keeping her alive, how she knew with perfect clarity, that this hatred was evil, and that she was going to die in Virginia, and that she was going to take everything she had and throw it into the mouth of that hatred before she went. Celestine listened. She kept writing. Sometimes Madame Honorine would fall silent for long stretches, and Celestine would work alone, the only sound in the room the scratch of the pen. Sometimes Madame would begin to weep, which was not like her, and Celestine would put down the pen and bring her water in the small silver cup. And sometimes Madame would reach out her trembling right hand, and Celestine would take it. Not as a slave takes the hand of her mistress, but as one woman takes the hand of another in the middle of the night, and would hold it until Madame fell asleep. The room itself, during those 11 days, took on a particular quality. The shutters were closed during the daylight hours, because Madame could no longer tolerate bright light. The windows were cracked at night, to let out the heat of the oil lamps, and the closeness of the 2 bodies in the confined space. The air smelled of the ink, and of the coffee used to age the paper, and of the camphor Madame Voisin sent up for Madame's rheumatism, and of the particular sour, sweet smell of illness that settles over any sick room after the first week. Also, there was a large carved armoire against the wall opposite the bed, its doors closed, which Madame had said nothing about, and which Celestine did not open. There was a small oratory in the corner with a crucifix and a porcelain figure of the Virgin, before which Madame did not pray during those 11 days, which was itself a kind of statement. There was the writing desk, covered increasingly with papers in 3 separate piles, the completed forgeries, the rejected drafts awaiting burning, and the blank sheets waiting to be used. There was the bed, enormous dark mahogany, carved with grapes and vines, in which Madame had been born 73 years earlier, and in which she would die 11 days hence. There was the David at the foot where Celestine slept. There was the porcelain basin on the stand by the window, where Celestine washed in cold water once a day. And there was, outside the locked door, the rest of the world, which did not know what was happening inside the room, and which, through Madame Voisin's careful management, was being kept from asking. On the 5th day, Madame asked Celestine to read aloud to her. Her eyes had grown too weak for sustained reading, and she wanted to hear the pages of a book of sermons by a 17th-century French bishop that she had kept on her bedside table for 40 years. Celestine, who had never been permitted to acknowledge her literacy to her mistress, hesitated. And now, Madame said without looking up, they were past the point of pretending. So Celestine read. Her French was careful, her pronunciation formal, her voice lower than the housekeeper had ever heard her speak. Madame listened with her eyes closed. When Celestine finished a passage, Madame would sometimes comment, sometimes correct the pronunciation of an archaic word, sometimes simply ask her to go on. For an hour each afternoon, for the remaining 6 days, they did this. A woman who had owned another woman for that other woman's entire life. Listening to her read from a book of Catholic sermons about mercy in the gray light of a shuttered room, in which they were jointly manufacturing evidence of a crime that had not been committed against a woman neither of them had seen in a decade. On the 6th day, Madame asked Celestine whether her mother Philomene had been happy. Celestine put down the pen. She considered the question for a long time. She said at last that she did not know whether her mother had been happy. She said that her mother had loved her. She said that her mother had taught her to read in a corner of the kitchen on Sunday afternoons, when the family was at Mass, using a stick to trace letters in a flour, dusted surface of the worktable, so that no written evidence would survive. She said that her mother had told her many times that learning was the one thing that could not be taken away once it was in the head. She said her mother had been proud of her. She did not say whether she herself had been happy. Madame did not ask. On the 7th day, Madame asked Celestine what she wanted, not as an instruction, not rhetorically, as a question. What did Celestine personally want from her life if she could have anything? Celestine did not answer for a long time. Then she said, in a voice so quiet Madame had to lean forward to hear it, that she wanted to live somewhere where no one could knock on a door and take her away. That was all she said. Madame did not respond. She closed her eyes, and she did not open them again for 2 hours. On the 8th day, Madame Honorine asked Celestine a question. She asked it without looking up. She asked in French whether Celestine had loved her own mother, Philomene. Celestine answered that she had. Madame asked whether Celestine thought Philomene had loved her. Celestine answered that she had. Madame was silent for a long time. Then she said, in a voice so thin it was almost breath, that she wished she had allowed the doctor to come to Philomene in the winter of '51. She did not apologize. She did not ask for forgiveness. She simply said the sentence in the flat way. She might have said that it was going to rain. And then she went back to dictating the next letter. On the 10th day, Celestine did something that she had not been instructed to do, that she had not planned, that she had not, as far as I can tell from what survives, even fully understood she was doing until the moment was past. She switched. She was writing at that moment the third and most dangerous of the forgeries. The affidavit in Odette's hand over Odette's forged signature acknowledging refusal to support her mother. She had been working on it for a day and a half. Madame Honorine, exhausted, had dozed off at around 300ers in the afternoon, her head fallen forward on her chest, her breath ragged. Celestine looked at her sleeping mistress. She looked down at the document she was producing, and instead of continuing in the hand of Odette, producing Odette's false confession, she began very quietly to write something else. She wrote in her own hand on a fresh sheet of paper the truth. She wrote that she, Celestine, property of Madame Honorine Thibaudaux of Belle Fontaine Plantation in the parish of Iberville, Louisiana, aged approximately 26 years, being instructed by her mistress to produce forged correspondence intended to establish false grounds for the disinheritance of Madame Odette Calix of St. Louis, did hereby state, under such oath as a person in her condition could give, that the said correspondence was forged by her own hand under duress, under her mistress's dictation, in the locked bedchamber of Madame Thibaudaux, over the course of the preceding days. She listed the specific documents she had produced. She described the methods used to age them. She named the persons who had entered the bedchamber, the notary Delacroix, and the date. She named herself. She signed it. She had been taught to read and write by her mother, Philomene. Her mother, Philomene, had been taught by a previous mistress at a plantation near Pointe-Coupee decades before, and had carried the skill in secret through her life and had passed it in secret to her daughter. And now, in a locked room in the autumn of '53, that secret literacy, smuggled through 2 generations of enslaved women, was being used to produce the only honest document in the entire affair. Celestine folded the paper. She hid it in the lining of her apron, between the inner and outer layers, where she had slit the seam 2 days before for exactly this purpose. She returned to the forgery. She completed it in Odette's hand. She set it on top of the pile. On the morning of November 14th, Madame Honorine did not wake up. Just as the horror, in this Louisiana plantation house, reaches its darkest hour, I want to ask you something. If what you are hearing tonight is holding you the way it held me when I first uncovered these documents, please share this video with a friend who loves dark American history. Hit the like button to tell the algorithm that stories like this matter, and subscribe if you have not already. Because in our next investigation, we are traveling to the Pine Barrens of New Jersey to uncover a story of institutional corruption that has been buried for 170 years. Let us find out together what happened in the last hours at Belle Fontaine. Celestine found her mistress at about 1600 in the morning. She had fallen asleep in the small daybed at the foot of Madame's own bed, as she had every night for 11 nights. When she woke, she heard, immediately, the absence. The sound of Madame's labored breathing, which had filled the room every night, was gone. She rose. She crossed to the bed. She put her hand on Madame's cheek. It was cool. She stood there for a long time in the gray light. Then she did the only thing she knew to do. She opened the door. Madame Voisin, who had heard the door open, came at once from the other end of the corridor. She entered the bedchamber. She saw her mistress dead in the bed. She saw Celestine standing by the writing desk with her hands at her sides. She saw on the desk the completed pile of documents. And she understood. In one long moment of looking from the papers to Celestine to Madame's body and back, a great deal of what had happened in that room. She was a practical woman. She had served the Thibaudaux family for 51 years. She did 3 things in the next hour. First, she closed the bedchamber door and locked it again, this time with Celestine inside. Second, she went downstairs and woke the overseer, Bertrand Sicard, telling him that Madame had passed in the night and that the bedchamber must remain sealed until the notary could be summoned. Third, she sent the stable boy with a message, not to Arsenie, who was sleeping off the previous night's brandy, and not to the notary Delacroix in Donaldsonville, but to the parish priest at the Catholic church 3 miles away, with a whispered instruction that the priest should come not to perform last rites which were now too late, but to witness. When the priest arrived at 8:00 in the morning, Madame Voisin took him directly upstairs. She unlocked the bedchamber door. She went inside with the priest and with Celestine alone. And there, in the presence of the dead woman and the young slave and the old free Creole housekeeper, the priest, Father Etienne Rouillet, 44 years old, Breton by origin, who had been at Donaldsonville for 6 years, heard from Celestine's own lips what had happened over the preceding 11 days. Celestine told him everything. She produced from the lining of her apron the statement she had written in her own hand on the 10th day. She gave it to him. She told him that she did not know what would happen to her now, but that she wanted the truth to exist somewhere in the world outside this room, where her mistress could no longer reach it. The priest read the statement. He read it twice. Then he did something that I believe saved Celestine's life, though it cost him his position in the diocese within the year. He took the statement. He folded it. He placed it in the inner pocket of his cassock. Then he turned to Madame Voisin and said in French, a single sentence. The sentence, recorded later in Madame Voisin's Freedman's Bureau testimony of 67, was this: "We will say that Madame was alone." They went back downstairs. They met Bertrand Sicard and Arsenie, who had now been woken, and they told them that Madame had died in the night, alone, having dismissed her maid the evening before. Celestine was sent back to the laundry quarters. The bedchamber was opened to the family. The pile of documents on the writing desk was gathered up by Arsenie, who knew immediately what they were, and who, in a moment of decision that I believe was the only honorable act of his adult life, said nothing to anyone about the fact that the ink on several of them was still less than 3 days dry. Arsenie, you see, had also understood something in the last 2 weeks. He had understood that if those documents reached the notary Delacroix, and if they were entered into the record, and if Odette were in fact disinherited by authentic act of Article 1521, then a vast new legal dispute would open up. The diocese would challenge the document. Odette and her husband, Hyacinthe Caylux, would fight it in the courts. The handwriting would be examined by experts in New Orleans. The forgeries might or might not be detected. The case might go on for a decade. And even if Arsenie and the diocese won, Arsenie's share would be consumed by lawyers. Whereas, if Madame died without executing the New Testament, the existing one, which gave the disposable quarter to the diocese and the forced 3 quarters to Odette, would stand. Arsenie would inherit nothing under the old will, but, under Louisiana law, as Arsenie knew, if Odette died without children, which she had so far not produced, Arsenie would be next in line as Madame's nearest collateral relative, and Odette was 41 years old, sickly, and childless, and there was, in 1853, no reliable treatment for the condition Arsenie had been quietly told by the family physician in St. Louis, through a mutual acquaintance, that his cousin was suffering from. Arsenie burned the documents that evening, all of them, in the fireplace of Madame's own bedchamber, including, had he noticed it, the sheet of paper in Celestine's own hand that Father Rouillet had already taken away. Odette arrived at Belle Fontaine on November 18th. She was met at the front gallery by Arsenie and by the notary Delacroix, who had been summoned for the reading of the will. The will was read. It was the old will, the one that gave her the forced 3 quarters and the diocese the disposable quarter. Odette wept, not for her mother, but from the release of 10 years of dread over what her mother might have done. Hyacinthe Caylux, her husband, took possession of the estate on her behalf within the week. Arsenie Pontalba was given 2,000 zalozend and his horse and told, civilly, that he was no longer welcome at Belle Fontaine. He went back to New Orleans. He died 4 years later of typhus in a boarding house near the French Market. And he was not missed. Odette lived for another 11 years. She never had children. She died of the condition her mother had known about and had not named. A cancer of the breast. In Celestine. Louis in the summer of 64, while her husband's commission firm was being ruined by the Union blockade of the lower Mississippi, Belle Fontaine passed, in accordance with her will, to her husband, Hyacinth, who sold it in 1869 to a northern consortium. The house was used as a rice mill for 30 years. It burned in 1902. The foundations can still be seen in a cleared field 2 miles off the river road, by anyone who knows where to look. Father E.T. Sanruile left the parish of Donaldsonville in the spring of 1854, under what the diocesan records describe as a disagreement with his bishop. He went north. He served a small mission parish in Illinois for 20 years. He died in 1876. Among his papers, when they were sent back to the diocesan archive in New Orleans after his death, was an envelope marked in French with a single phrase, "The truth from Belle Fontaine." Inside were 3 sheets of paper. 2 were his own notes made after the events of November 14th. The third was Celestine's statement in her own hand. That envelope sat in the diocesan archive, unfiled and uncatalogued, for 97 years. It was discovered in 1973 by a graduate student working on a dissertation about Louisiana succession law. But the student did not understand what he had found. He photocopied the documents and returned the originals to the folder. The photocopies went into his research file. The research file, after he abandoned the dissertation and left academia, was donated in 2008 to a small historical society in Baton Rouge. It sat in a box for 11 more years. I found it in the autumn of 2019 by accident while looking for something else. As for Celestine, Madame Voisin, in her Freedmen's Bureau testimony of 67, states that Celestine remained at Belle Fontaine under Hyacinth Cailloux's ownership for 7 more years, working as a seamstress in the household, never speaking of what had happened in the locked room. In the summer of 1861, when Louisiana seceded and Hyacinth began to fear that his property north and south would be disputed by both sides of the coming war, he executed in New Orleans an act of emancipation for 11 of his wife's inherited slaves, including Celestine. The act survives. It is on file at the Louisiana State Archives. Celestine's emancipation was unconditional. She received with it a sum of 180 in silver and a letter of introduction to a free Creole family in New Orleans with whom she could take shelter. She used the money in the letter. She went to New Orleans. She worked as a seamstress in the Faubourg Marigny through the war. She married in 1868 a free man of color named Jean-Baptiste Lafleur, who worked as a clerk for a cotton factor on Canal Street. They had 2 children. She lived until 1891. She is buried in St. Louis Cemetery No. 2 in New Orleans, in a small above-ground tomb that still stands. Though the name on the marble has almost weathered away, she never, as far as the surviving record shows, spoke of what happened in the locked bedchamber at Belle Fontaine in the autumn of 53. Not to her husband, not to her children, not to the Freedmen's Bureau. She left behind no diary, no memoir, no letters of her own. The only document we have in her voice is the one she wrote at the small writing desk on the 10th day, with her mistress sleeping beside her, which survived because a Breton priest in Illinois kept it in an envelope in his desk for 22 years, and which tells us, in one single page in a careful and practiced hand, what she did and why she did it. She did not free herself. She could not. The forgeries she produced for her mistress were destroyed with her mistress's death before they could do any damage. And her own honest statement was preserved by chance and conscience in places she never knew. The crime she was ordered to commit was never executed. The daughter was not disinherited. The plantation did not pass to the nephew. Everything her mistress tried to do in those 11 days was undone by her own death before it could take effect. And Celestine's single honest document, which would have blown the forgeries apart had they ever been presented to a court, sat undisturbed for almost 170 years. But consider what she did. In a society that denied her every form of legal personhood, she produced, from inside a locked room in which she was held as an instrument of her mistress's hatred, a document that asserted her own existence as a moral witness. She described what she was doing. She refused to allow the record of it to rest only in the hands of the woman who had compelled it. She carried it out of the room in the lining of her apron. She placed it in the hands of the one free person she thought might preserve it. And she went back to her work in the laundry and said nothing and waited. The horror of Belle Fontaine is not that a cruel old woman tried to disinherit her daughter. Cruel old women have been trying to disinherit their daughters for as long as there have been inheritances. The horror is the machinery. The horror is the idea that the entire weight of 113 years of a family's accumulated wealth, the land, labor, blood, and silence, could rest in its final hour on whether a 26-year-old woman who was not even considered a legal person would choose to use the hand her mother had secretly trained to produce a lie, or to produce the truth. And it rested there because, and only because, the laws of that society had made her invisible. A person cannot be a witness, but Celestine was not a person under the Code Civil of 1825. She was a thing. Things do not testify. Things cannot lie in court. Things, in the cold logic of the Louisiana planters, were the perfect instrument of fraud, because no forgery produced by a thing could ever be traced back to a human author who might be called into a courtroom to confess. Madame Honorine Thibodeaux understood this perfectly. It was why she chose Celestine. Mostly it was why she locked the door. It was why she believed, as she dictated her lies in the gray October light, that she had solved the problem of her forced heirship daughter once and for all by simply reaching for the one witness in her household who could never be a witness. She was wrong. Not because the law changed. The law did not change. Not because Celestine was discovered. Because she was not. Madame was wrong because Celestine, whose mother's name was Philomene, and whose grandmother's name we do not know, had learned something in secret, generations deep, that Madame had never imagined. She had learned that the hand can testify even when the voice cannot. She had learned that paper outlives everything. She had learned that there are ways of speaking that do not require permission. They can be folded into the lining of an apron. They can be carried out of a locked room and placed in the palm of a priest. She had learned, in other words, that she was a person, and she had known it all 11 days, while her mistress sat beside her dictating the fiction that she was not. This mystery of Belle Fontaine shows us something we do not want to see about how American wealth was built in the old French parishes of Louisiana. It shows us that the machinery of inheritance, the forms of law, the careful legitimations of property passing from one generation to the next, depended at their deepest and most intimate level on the compelled complicity of the people that same law refused to recognize as human. It shows us that a single locked bedchamber could contain, at the same moment, the full ugliness of that system and a quiet private act of human dignity that the system was not designed to permit and could not fully erase. Celestine's statement exists. I have seen it. It is 12 inches by 8 inches. It is written in careful French in a hand that was never meant to have been trained. It ends with her signature. A single word, the only name she ever gave herself on paper in her entire life. And that signature, in the autumn of '53, in a locked room on a decaying sugar plantation in the parish of Iberville, is louder than every forged letter her mistress ever made her write. What do you think of this story? Do you believe that every corner of it has been revealed? Or do you think there are pieces still buried in the archives of Louisiana and the old diocesan records that might someday tell us more about Celestine, about Father Rouillet, about Madame Voisin, about who else might have known? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I read every one. If this story has stayed with you tonight, subscribe to the channel, ring the notification bell, and share this video with someone who loves dark American history. I will see you in the next investigation. Until then, keep listening for the voices the record was not designed to preserve. They are there. You only have to know how to find them.